He is not crying. The man in the photograph sits still, spine bent forward, gaze locked not on the camera but on something far more unbearable, the small bundle of cloth resting in his lap. Inside it are two severed hands. They belong to his son. The boy is gone, not because of sickness, not because of war, but because his village didn't meet its rubber quota. This is not a battlefield. There are no rifles firing overhead, no trenches, no enemy lines. No declarations, no flags, no honor. What happened in the Congo Free State wasn't war, it was policy, it was commerce, and it was managed like a business with quotas, audits, and punishment. From 1885 to 1908, King Leopold II of Belgium controlled the Congo not as a colony, but as his personal property. He called it a civilizing mission. He branded it the Congo Free State. But the truth was far from freedom. It was a human meat grinder operating under the seal of a European crown. Rubber was booming. The world needed tires, factories needed belts, machines needed tubing. And the Congo was full of wild rubber vines, but to collect it, Leopold didn't hire workers, he took them. He conscripted entire villages under threat of violence. He deployed a private army, the Force Publique, armed with guns, whips, and quotas. Villagers were ordered to gather rubber. If they failed, they were punished. The punishment wasn't metaphorical. It came in the form of lashes, or fire, or the systematic mutilation of children. Hands were cut off, not randomly, but as proof. Proof that a bullet hadn't been wasted. Proof that punishment had been carried out. Proof that obedience had been enforced. One bullet, one hand, that was the math. Some had both hands removed, some had feet removed, some were beheaded. Others were simply left in the sun to die. Estimates vary, but historians agree. At least 10 million Congolese died during Leopold's reign. Not soldiers, not rebels, just people, farmers, mothers, children. And the man holding his son's hands in that photo, the one no one wants to look at. He wasn't unique, he was typical because this wasn't chaos. It was organized brutality, managed, funded, and defended by governments who knew. This wasn't genocide in the fog of war. It was murder by spreadsheet, death as a line item on a ledger, and the most horrifying part, it worked. Leopold II wasn't a conqueror, he never led an army. He never fired a gun in Africa, he wasn't even particularly beloved in his own country. He was the king of a small European nation, Belgium, a country that in the 19th century wasn't seen as a major colonial power. France, Britain, Spain, and Portugal had carved up the globe. Belgium was late to the game. Leopold knew it, and he hated it. He wanted more than a crown. He wanted an empire, not just land, but legacy. Something grand enough to etch his name into history and fill his pockets while doing it. But Belgium didn't want colonies. The government refused to fund overseas expansion. The people weren't interested. Parliament blocked his plans repeatedly, so Leopold took a different route. He bypassed Belgium entirely. Instead of acting as the king of a nation, he acted as a private investor. He created front companies, hired explorers, bribed European politicians, funded expeditions under the pretense of humanitarian aid. He branded himself as a philanthropist, a man who would bring Christianity, commerce, and civilization to the heart of darkness. In 1885, at the Berlin Conference, the infamous meeting where European powers divided Africa like a pie, Leopold was granted control of the Congo Basin. Not Belgium, him, personally. It was officially named the Congo Free State, but there was nothing free about it. Leopold ruled it as his private domain, 76 times the size of Belgium, with no oversight, no accountability, and no interest in anything but profit. He never visited Congo, he didn't have to, others did the dirty work. He built a regime through agents, mercenaries, and missionaries. Rubber was extracted, ivory looted, villages burned, entire populations enslaved, the profits. They flowed directly to him. Leopold used the money to build monuments, palaces, parks, museums. He transformed Brussels into a modern city, funded entirely by the blood of the Congolese people. And back home, many Belgians applauded him for it. For years, he was seen as a visionary, a modernizer, a builder of national glory. No one talked about the severed hands. No one talked about the children mutilated. No one talked about the forests of corpses left behind in the name of progress, because he wore a crown, because he gave them gardens, because the gold didn't smell like blood by the time it reached Europe. And that's how Leopold II became one of the deadliest men in modern history. Not by mistake, not by madness, but by calculated ambition, cloaked in the language of civilization. To the European public, King Leopold wasn't a tyrant, he was a visionary. That's what the newspapers said, that's what the pamphlets said, that's what the stained glass windows in Belgian churches whispered as sunlight passed through. That he brought light into darkness. Leopold didn't market his regime as conquest, he sold it as charity. He called his Congo project a philanthropic mission. He claimed he was eradicating slavery. He claimed he was spreading Christianity. He claimed he was uplifting African savages, bringing them out of ignorance and into the warm embrace of European morality. Posters showed white missionaries holding out Bibles, children kneeling to receive them, smiling Africans learning to read under Belgian flags. School books in Belgium printed maps where the Congo was shaded in gentle blues, labeled as the Congo Free State, a land liberated from tribal brutality, now under the guidance of European wisdom. Even the name itself, Free State, was a masterstroke of branding. It implied dignity, self-determination, progress. In reality, it was a prison. But the brilliance of Leopold's lie wasn't just in what he said. It was in what he didn't say. He didn't show the rubber quotas carved into children's skin. He didn't print the photos of villages burned for disobedience. He didn't explain that Christianization often meant forced labor, forced silence, forced disappearance. The missionaries he sent were not neutral. Many were complicit. They ran the schools. They taught in French and Flemish. They told children to forget their languages, their gods, their names. And when the force publique came to whip, to take hostages, to cut hands, the missionaries looked away or prayed over the bodies and wrote nothing, because as long as the narrative stayed intact, as long as the lie of civilization held, Europe didn't have to care. They didn't see exploitation, they saw order. They didn't hear screams, they heard progress. They didn't count bodies, they counted exports. And Leopold, he continued to build statues, fountains, libraries named after himself. All funded by a story that told white Europe, we're the good ones. And no one asked what made them deserve that role, because the answer would have forced them to look. At the hands, at the chains, at the trees bled dry, and realize. Civilization was never the point, only control. The trees didn't bleed on their own, people did. At the height of Leopold's rubber empire, Congo wasn't a nation. It was a plantation of pain, no factories, no industry. No voluntary labor, just forests filled with vines and bodies forced to extract from them. Rubber came from wild vines deep in the jungle. It wasn't like the neat rows of trees in Southeast Asia or Brazil. To get it, Congolese workers had to trek for miles, often barefoot into dense brush. They would slice into the vines, let the white sap drip out, then spread it directly onto their skin. It hardened, they scraped it off, sometimes with knives, sometimes with bare hands, taking skin with it. The process was agonizing, slow, and endless, and it had to be repeated daily. But the worst part wasn't the pain, it was the quotas. Each village was assigned a rubber quota by colonial officers. If they met it, they might survive another week. If they failed, even slightly, the punishment was immediate and brutal. The Force Publique, Leopold's private army, didn't operate like a police force. They were enforcers, armed with rifles, whips made of hippopotamus hide, called chikats, and full authority to do anything necessary to meet their numbers. They beat people until the skin peeled off in strips. They took hostages, wives, daughters, entire families, and kept them in cages until the men returned with enough rubber. And if the rubber didn't come, they killed the hostages, or worse. But they couldn't just shoot people indiscriminately. Bullets were expensive. Each soldier had to account for every round fired, and so a system emerged, the system that still haunts every photograph, every testimony. For every bullet used, they had to return a severed hand. It didn't matter whose hand. Rebels, civilians, children. If the soldier missed his shot, he would cut off the hand of a living person and bring that instead. If they needed to inflate their kill count, they cut off hands from corpses. Entire villages became forests of dismemberment. Men came home with sacks of hands instead of food. Women were told their children would be spared if they watched. Children's hands were cut off first because it was easier, because it sent a message. Rubber output soared, profits exploded. Leopold grew rich, so did his contractors, so did the Belgian state, and no one in Europe heard the screams. They heard numbers, they saw charts, they called it development, but in Congo people called it a curse. The trees they bled for became symbols of death, the jungle became a prison. And the only thing growing faster than the vines was the number of missing hands. The numbers weren't suggestions, they were commands. Every village was assigned a quota, a set number of kilograms of rubber they had to deliver each week. Not by harvest, not by machine, but by hand, bare hands, human backs, human skin. And if the number wasn't met, there was no grace period. There was punishment, immediate, public, violent. The agents of King Leopold's Congo Free State didn't just enforce rules, they enforced terror. Rubber quotas were posted like tax ledgers. Failure to meet them was met with whippings, hostage-taking, mutilation, or death. The chikat, a whip made from dried, twisted hippopotamus hide, was the most common tool of discipline. 5 lashes would slice the skin, 20 would draw blood, 100 could kill a man, but whips weren't enough. They needed to scare the others, they needed proof, so came the hands. For every bullet fired, officers required a hand as evidence, not to honor the dead, but to prove that a bullet hadn't been wasted on hunting or rebellion. And so hands became currency, accounting, a grotesque substitute for receipts. Soldiers would present baskets of severed hands to their superiors. Some were shriveled and burnt, some were fresh, still dripping. All were tagged to villages, to quotas, to metrics. And when soldiers couldn't meet their hand count honestly, they got creative. They'd kill random civilians, children, women, and cut off their hands instead. Some simply cut off hands from living captives to avoid wasting a bullet. In some regions, villagers began cutting off their own dead relatives' hands just to appease the soldiers to stop further killings. They didn't care whose hands. They just needed enough. Hands became numbers, numbers became performance, performance became promotion. There are documented reports of officers boasting about their quotas met, not in rubber but in body parts. This wasn't chaos. It was calculated mutilation. Children walked around missing limbs before they could speak. Whole generations grew up without fingers, without parents, without names. And in Europe, Leopold's men presented statistics. Production up 200%. Rebels pacified. Trade expanding. No one asked what that cost, because hands don't scream in reports. They don't haunt telegrams. They don't show up in budgets. They just count. There was no war, no battlefield, no opposing army. No generals drawing lines in the dirt. No treaties signed in the ruins of cities. And yet, by the time King Leopold II was forced to relinquish the Congo Free State in 1908, at least 10 million people were dead. Not soldiers, not rebels, not combatants, just villagers, mothers, children, men too old to run, women too tired to scream. They didn't die all at once. They died in waves, slow, grinding, systematic. Some were executed outright for disobedience, for failing quotas, for resisting forced labor. Some starved to death after their crops were burned as punishment. Some died of disease in forced labor camps with no sanitation, no rest, no medicine. Others simply disappeared, marched into the jungle, and never seen again. Entire villages were wiped out, not just attacked, emptied. Local economies collapsed, families fragmented, languages lost, communities scattered. And what was it all for? Rubber, ivory, prestige, and the wealth of a European monarch who never set foot in the land he claimed to civilize. These weren't random atrocities. They weren't isolated incidents. This was policy. A regime of forced extraction enforced by guns, quotas, mutilation, and death. An economy built not on supply and demand, but on blood and silence. And when the death toll began to surface, when missionaries and whistleblowers started gathering reports, the world still hesitated. Because acknowledging it meant acknowledging complicity. France, Britain, Germany, they all knew. They traded with Leopold. They praised his progress. They profited. What happened in Congo was not unknown. It was ignored. Because it was useful, because it was profitable, because it was far away. Because the people dying didn't look like the people counting the money. 10 million, that's more than the Holocaust, more than Rwanda, more than Cambodia. But we don't say Congo when we talk about genocide. We say mismanagement. We say colonial excess. We say controversial legacy. But it wasn't any of those things. It was a slaughter without a battlefield. Without resistance, without mercy, and for decades. Without a name, the silence wasn't ignorance, it was design. European capitals didn't lack information, they lacked the will to care. Letters came, reports came, photographs came. Missionaries sent detailed accounts of atrocities, children mutilated, women chained, villages burnt to ash. Diplomats wrote of mass killings. Merchants whispered of strange business practices. Even explorers, hardened men who had seen death in deserts and jungles, were disturbed. And yet the chambers of Europe stayed quiet. Why? Because King Leopold's Congo wasn't a rogue colony, it was a business partner. France traded with it, Britain imported ivory from it, Germany negotiated treaties with it. The United States was among the first to recognize Leopold's private rule, legitimizing the Congo Free State as a sovereign entity in the eyes of the world. Rubber flowed out, profits flowed in, and in the salons of Brussels, London, and Paris, no one wanted to ask what those profits were soaked in. Members of the Belgian elite received shares in Leopold's holding companies. Bankers financed infrastructure projects paid for with Congolese labor. Even the church, which had missionaries on the ground, remained cautious, torn between moral responsibility and loyalty to the monarch who funded their expansion. It wasn't just silence, it was complicity. Newspapers avoided the topic, schools taught nothing of it, and when pressed, Leopold's spokesman deflected, calling critics anti-progress, unpatriotic, or misinformed. To question the Congo system was to question European superiority itself. because if Leopold's actions were criminal, what did that make the others? What did that say about Britain and India, about France and Algeria, about Germany and Southwest Africa? Better to look away, better to call it controversial. Better to say some abuses rather than genocide. The world knew, but it preferred to not know too loudly. And that's how 10 million people vanished, not in secret, but in the open. Beneath the paper-thin comfort of polite European denial, they weren't kings, they weren't soldiers, they weren't even Congolese. But they saw and they could not unsee. The first was E.D. Morel, a shipping clerk at a Liverpool port. He noticed something odd. Ships left Belgium loaded with weapons, chains, and ammunition. But they returned full not with goods, not with trade items, but with rubber and ivory. No exchange, no cargo going in, only extraction coming out. And Morel realized this wasn't commerce, it was theft. At a scale so massive, so organized, so brutal that it could only mean one thing, a population being drained like a mine. He quit his job, started writing, speaking, printing pamphlets with titles like Red Rubber. He showed the math, he printed the maps, he named the system, slavery under a European crown. Then came Roger Casement, a British consul. He was sent to Congo to investigate, to either confirm or silence the rumors. What he returned with was impossible to ignore. He traveled upriver, interviewed survivors, documented hundreds of testimonies. He described villages razed to nothing, children missing limbs, entire communities vanished. And he wrote it down, all of it, in what would become the Casement Report of 1904. Casement didn't just describe the atrocities, he named them, and for the first time, Europe was forced to read its own reflection. Together, Morel and Casement became a movement. They founded the Congo Reform Association, launched protests, lobbied parliaments, gave speeches that echoed through the halls of British and Belgian power. They were not alone, missionaries. African eyewitnesses, a few brave journalists joined them, but they were outnumbered, outfunded, and slowly undermined. Morel was smeared as a fanatic. Casement, years later, would be arrested not for Congo, but for supporting Irish independence. When he was sentenced to death, officials leaked his private diaries to discredit him. His reputation shattered, his execution quietly approved, the movement lost steam, and the atrocities in Congo, they didn't end. They just changed hands from Leopold's private rule to the Belgian state where the silence resumed. And yet without these men, the truth might have stayed buried forever. They didn't stop the system, but they cracked it. They gave the dead a voice, and even now, long after their bones have turned to dust, we owe them that echo when the international outcry grew too loud. When the photos of severed hands and burnt villages reached London, Paris, and eventually Brussels, King Leopold II was forced to act. But he didn't go on trial, he wasn't exiled, he wasn't punished, he made a deal. In 1908, Leopold graciously handed over control of the Congo Free State to the Belgian government. And just like that, the crimes of one man became the property of a nation, rebranded, repackaged, erased. The Congo was no longer a private terror zone, now it was a colony, a legitimate part of the Belgian Empire. A place for schools, railroads, and moral improvement. The rubber quotas faded, the force publique remained, the pain continued, only with better paperwork, but the real damage wasn't just to the Congolese people. It was to the truth. Belgium began rewriting its legacy almost immediately. Leopold, the Butcher of Africa, became Leopold the Builder. His name was stamped on parks, museums, and public buildings. Statues went up, not down. Avenue du Roy, Place Leopold, Boulevard Leopold II. The man who oversaw the death of millions now stood in bronze, saluted by schoolchildren. Belgian textbooks downplayed the violence. They called it controversial. They used words like expansion, development, difficult history, rarely genocide. Generations grew up never hearing the word Congo spoken with shame. Instead, they were told Belgium had brought roads, trains, hospitals. Catholicism, and in the former colony, no monuments were built for the dead, no reparations were paid, no acknowledgement was given. In the official narrative, Leopold gave Congo to Belgium like a gift. Like a father handing over his legacy, but the legacy was blood, the inheritance was bones, and to this day, many Belgians walk past his statues, sit in parks he built with Congolese labor, study in institutions funded by plunder, and never ask whose hands paid for it. You didn't hear about this in school, not because the information doesn't exist, but because it doesn't serve the right people. There are no blockbuster films about Leopold II. No global remembrance days for the Congolese genocide, no museums in Western capitals built to preserve the memory of the millions mutilated in silence. There are Holocaust memorials, there are 9/11 memorials. There are statues for soldiers, generals, even kings, but for 10 million Congolese, nothing. And yet the records remain, the reports, the photos, the names of the villages, the quota sheets, the orders signed, the hands counted. So why don't we talk about it? Because the victims were African, because the killer wore a European crown, because the prophets fed banks, palaces, universities, because to confront it fully means admitting that the wealth of Europe, the beauty of its cities, was paid for in blood. And because if we call it what it was, genocide, we would have to rewrite everything. Leopold would go from builder to butcher. Belgium would go from civilizer to colonizer. Europe would go from enlightened to implicated. And the myth that colonialism was about roads and railways and education, would crack, crumble, collapse because colonialism wasn't about lifting others up. It was about taking everything and giving back silence. That's why you never heard about it, because silence protects the powerful, because forgetting is convenient, because memory is dangerous. And if 10 million people can be erased, if a king can kill and still have statues, then history isn't just written by the victors. It's written by the ones who got away with it. But now, you know, and once you know, you don't get to forget.